Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the Star Wars galaxy to uncover one of its most haunting hidden mysteries from the Clone Wars. The kind of secret that has been whispered about in forgotten corners of Republic archives, where ancient Jedi prophecies once warned of an army born from darkness and a legion that vanished without a trace. It's a story filled with unexpected revelations, lost knowledge, and truths that were buried beneath the rubble of a galactic war that changed everything. So before we begin this journey together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's adventure. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep explorations into beloved worlds. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing our global community come together for these stories. Now, get comfortable. Maybe adjust your lighting, settle into your favorite spot, and let's begin tonight's journey together. In the deepest vaults of Kamino, where the endless rains have beaten against titanium walls for countless rotations, there exists a file that should not exist. Its designation is simple, clinical, cold, batch, Omega-07. But the clones who knew its true meaning called it something else entirely. They called it the Ghost Battalion. The file itself tells a story that Republic records claim never happened, of 10,000 clone troopers who possessed something no clone was ever meant to have, of a legion that fought not just with blasters and tactics but with abilities that should have belonged only to Jedi, of soldiers who began to dream, to question, to feel echoes of something ancient stirring in their identical minds. Commander Rex himself once said that some battles leave scars deeper than flesh, deeper than memory, scars that cut into the very essence of what makes a being who they are. He was speaking of the Battle of Ryloth, or so the histories claim. But those who knew Rex in his final years knew he was speaking of something else entirely, something that happened in the Outer Rim, in a star system that no longer appears on any navigation charts. There, on a world whose name has been erased from every database, 10,000 clones discovered they were more than their programming, more than their purpose, more than anyone ever intended them to be. And for that discovery, they paid a price that echoes still through the Force itself. The official reports state that the 327th Legion was lost to separatist ambush. Clean, simple, final. But in the deepest meditation chambers of the Jedi Temple, Master Yoda would sometimes pause mid-sentence, his ancient eyes growing distant, and whisper a single phrase, "Felt their passing, I did. But passing into what? No, I do not." What happened to Batch Omega-07 was not just a military tragedy. It was the moment when an army built to serve discovered they had souls worth saving. But souls come with a price. They bring choice. They bring the terrible, wonderful burden of free will. And in a galaxy built on the assumption that some beings are born to serve while others are born to rule, such a discovery could not be allowed to stand. The story begins with a question asked by a clone trooper designated CT-5555, though his brothers knew him by another name. It begins with Five standing in the sterile corridors of Kamino, looking at his own reflection and asking the question that would doom 10,000 of his brothers. "If we're all supposed to be the same," Fives whispered to his reflection, "watching Kamino's eternal storms rage beyond the transperistyle, then why do I dream of things I've never seen?" That question would set in motion events that reached into the highest levels of the Jedi Council, the deepest secrets of Sith manipulation, and the very heart of what it means to be truly alive in a galaxy that seemed determined to define some beings as nothing more than tools of war. Tonight we follow that question into the darkness. We trace its path through classified reports and deleted files, through the memories of clones who survived what should have been their finest hour, and into the echoing chambers of Jedi prophecy, where warnings of a chosen army had been misunderstood for 1,000 generations. This is the story of the Ghost Battalion. The story of 10,000 clones who discovered they were more than the sum of their programming, and the story of why, in the end, that discovery could not be allowed to survive. In the silence between star systems, their voices still call out, not in pain, not in anger, but in hope. They call out with the voices of soldiers who finally understood what they were fighting for, just moments before they lost everything. The Coruscant Jedi Temple stood against the dawn sky like a monument to forgotten wisdom, its ancient spires catching the first light of a galaxy at war. In the deepest levels of the temple where few Jedi ever ventured, the archives held secrets that predated the Republic itself. Here, among holocrons, older than memory and data crystals that hummed with Force energy, you began your work as senior archivist to the Jedi Council. Your assignment seemed routine at first. The Clone Wars had generated mountains of data, battle reports, casualty lists, strategic analyses. Someone needed to catalog it all, to ensure that future generations would understand the price of this conflict. But routine assignments in wartime have a way of becoming anything but routine, especially when they lead you into the forgotten corners of galactic history. The morning that changed everything began like any other. You arrived at the archives before dawn, when the temple was still quiet except for the distant hum of meditation chambers and the soft whisper of ancient ventilation systems. The air itself felt thick with history here, charged with the presence of countless Jedi who had walked these halls across millennia. Master Jocasta Nu, the chief librarian, greeted you with her usual mixture of warmth and scholarly intensity. Her eyes, bright with intelligence, despite her advanced years, held secrets you were only beginning to understand. Another day among the chronicles of war, she said, gesturing toward the towering shelves of data storage units, though I suspect today may prove more interesting than most. Your workstation occupied a quiet alcove overlooking the main archive floor, where Padawans occasionally came to research ancient lightsaber forms or study the philosophies of long-dead masters. The view was magnificent, stretching across layers upon layers of knowledge that seemed to extend into infinity. But your attention was focused on something far more immediate and troubling. The files you'd been assigned to catalog dealt with clone trooper deployment records, casualty reports from the Outer Rim campaigns, and what the military bureaucrats euphemistically called personnel irregularities. Most of it was standard wartime documentation, the kind of grim accounting that war demanded, but scattered throughout the official reports were fragments of something else entirely, references to classified experiments, mentions of enhanced capabilities in certain clone units, and most disturbing of all, consistent gaps in the records. It was Clone Commander Kix who first brought the pattern to your attention. He'd arrived at the temple that morning, carrying a datapad filled with questions that his military training couldn't answer. Kix was different from most clones you'd encountered. Where others showed the disciplined efficiency of their training, Kix displayed something that could only be called curiosity. His eyes held depth that seemed to go beyond his programmed parameters. "I've been reviewing casualty reports from the Outer Rim," Kix said, settling into the chair across from your workstation. His armor bore the scars of countless battles, but his voice carried the careful precision of someone who had learned to question official explanations. "There are patterns that don't make sense. Units that disappear from records entirely, battles that supposedly never happened, and brothers who remember things differently than the official reports claim." He activated his datapad, displaying a series of military communications that had been marked for archival storage. The data scrolled past in neat columns of numbers and designations, but Kix's trained eye had spotted something the bureaucrats had missed. "Look at this deployment schedule for the 327th Legion." According to these records, they were engaged in routine patrol operations in the Mid-Rim. But I served alongside men from the 327th and they told me stories about a world that doesn't appear on any star charts. A world where something happened that changed everything. The pieces began to fall into place as you examined Kix's data alongside your own archived files. The 327th Legion, along with several other clone units, had been assigned to what official records called deep reconnaissance missions. But the details of these missions were classified at levels that exceeded even Jedi Council clearance. More troubling still, the units assigned to these missions had casualty rates that defied statistical probability. Your investigation led you deeper into the Temple's restricted archives, where Master Nu granted you special access to files that had been sealed since the war's early days. Here, among documents that few living beings had ever seen, you discovered the first references to something called the Kaminoan Enhancement Project. The files were heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. The project had involved genetic modifications to certain clone batches, modifications that went far beyond the standard parameters established by the Republic military. These enhanced clones displayed abilities that their creators couldn't fully explain or control. Some showed remarkable intuitive tactical abilities. Others demonstrated what could only be described as precognitive awareness in battle. And a few, according to the most classified reports, began to exhibit sensitivity to what the Kaminoans called environmental energy fluctuations. Master Nu joined you in reviewing these files, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "The Force," she said quietly. "They were describing sensitivity to the Force, but that should be impossible. The Kaminoans claimed they could create soldiers, but they knew nothing of the deeper mysteries of the galaxy. How could they accidentally create Force-sensitive clones?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything you thought you understood about the war. Clone troopers were meant to be identical, predictable, controllable. They were bred for loyalty and combat effectiveness, nothing more. The idea that some might possess abilities that even the Jedi didn't fully understand was both fascinating and terrifying. Kix had been studying the files alongside you, his expression growing more intense as the implications became clear. "My brothers who served with the enhanced units, they talked about dreams, shared dreams, visions of battles that hadn't happened yet. And some of them claimed they could sense things about the enemy that briefings never mentioned. Command dismissed it as combat stress. But what if it was something more? The afternoon brought a new development that changed the direction of your investigation entirely. A message arrived through secure Jedi channels, its origin encrypted beyond normal recognition protocols. The message was brief, almost cryptic. "The Ghost Battalion remembers what the Republic forgot. Kamino holds answers, but questions carry a price. Seek the truth about Batch Omega 07. But know that some secrets were buried for reasons that transcend politics or war." Master Nu's reaction to the message was immediate and concerning. Her face went pale, and for a moment her usual scholarly composure cracked entirely. "Ghost Battalion," she whispered, as if the words themselves carried dangerous power. "I had hoped those files were lost forever." The rest of the day passed in preparation for a journey you hadn't expected to make. Master Nu had authorized access to a restricted Jedi transport, one equipped with stealth capabilities and long-range navigation systems. Kix had volunteered to accompany you, driven by loyalty to brothers whose stories didn't match official histories. And you found yourself at the center of an investigation that was rapidly expanding beyond simple archival work. As Coruscant's sun set behind the temple spires, casting long shadows across the archives, you realized that your quiet life among ancient texts and historical documents was ending. Tomorrow would bring new worlds, new secrets, and new questions about the true nature of the Clone Wars. The Ghost Battalion was waiting somewhere in the darkness between stars, and their story was calling you toward truths that the galaxy had tried very hard to forget. The hyperspace journey to Camino took 3 standard days, but it felt like a lifetime suspended between questions and answers. Your Jedi transport, the Seeker of Truth, cut through the swirling blue tunnel of hyperspace, while you, Kix, and Master Nu prepared for what awaited on the ocean world. The ship's archives contained everything the Jedi had compiled about clone production, but gaps in the data suggested that much had been deliberately obscured. Kix spent most of the journey in meditation, though his version looked different from traditional Jedi practice. He would sit perfectly still for hours, his eyes closed, as if listening to voices only he could hear. When you asked him about it, he explained that many clones had developed what they called the sharing, a way of connecting with their brothers across vast distances. It's strongest during hyperspace travel, he said. Something about the way space folds makes the connection clearer. And lately I've been hearing echoes from brothers who shouldn't be able to transmit anymore. Master Nu used the journey to decode additional layers of the encrypted files you discovered. Her expertise with ancient languages and forgotten codes proved invaluable as patterns emerged from what had initially seemed like random data corruption. The Kaminoans were more careful than we realized, she observed on the second day. They embedded their most sensitive research within cultural databases, disguising genetic modification protocols as historical records of their own species' evolution. The revelation was staggering. The enhancement project hadn't been a simple military upgrade. It had been an attempt to artificially recreate something the Kaminoans had lost in their own distant past. Their species had once possessed what they called the deep sight, an ability to perceive currents of possibility that flowed through all living things. Centuries of genetic manipulation to adapt to their changing world had bred this ability out of their population, but they had never stopped trying to reclaim it. When the Republic commissioned clone armies, the Kaminoans saw an opportunity. Using Gango Fett's genetic template as a base, they began experimenting with modifications that might restore their lost abilities. Most attempts failed entirely. Some produced clones with enhanced reflexes or improved tactical intuition. But a few batches, including the one designated Omega-07, began displaying capabilities that even their creators couldn't fully understand. The drop out of hyperspace near Camino was jarring, as it always was, but this time it carried additional weight. Below you spread the endless gray oceans of the clone homeworld, broken only by the gleaming cities that rose from the waves like technological coral reefs. Tipoca City dominated the view, its bioluminescent towers pulsing with the rhythm of countless production facilities. But your destination lay elsewhere, in a smaller research complex that official records claimed had been decommissioned years ago. The Kaminoan administrator who greeted your arrival was named Nala Se, and her reaction to your presence suggested that your visit was neither unexpected nor entirely welcome. Her large eyes studied each of you with careful assessment before she spoke. The Jedi Archive requests specified historical research access, she said in the precise musical tones of her species. But the facilities you wish to examine were sealed by order of the Republic military. We cannot provide unauthorized access to classified areas. Master Nu's response was diplomatically firm. The war has created new necessities for historical understanding. The Jedi Council requires comprehensive documentation of all clone-related research for the official record. Surely the Kaminoan government wishes to ensure accurate preservation of their scientific achievements. The negotiation that followed revealed layers of complexity you hadn't anticipated. The Kaminoans were proud of their cloning technology, but they were also deeply concerned about intellectual property rights and the potential military applications of their research. More importantly, they seemed genuinely worried about the implications of the enhancement project's results. The Omega-07 batch was terminated for safety reasons, Nala Se explained as she led you through corridors that hummed with the sound of genetic processing equipment. The subjects began displaying unpredictable behavioral patterns that could have compromised military effectiveness. Standard protocol required immediate discontinuation and disposal of all related materials. But Kix's questioning revealed inconsistencies in the official timeline. According to Republic deployment records, units from the Omega-07 batch had served in active combat for months after their supposed termination. Battle reports described their exceptional performance in situations that should have been impossible to survive. And most disturbing of all, other clone units began reporting shared experiences with soldiers who were supposed to no longer exist. The restricted research facility occupied an entire platform separate from Tipoca City's main complex. As your transport descended through Camino's perpetual storms, the structure emerged from the rain and mist like something from a dream. Its architecture was different from standard Caminoan design, more organic and flowing, as if it had been grown rather than built. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along its walls in rhythms that seemed almost hypnotic. Inside, the facility felt abandoned but not empty. Equipment still hummed with power, maintaining environmental systems for research that officially no longer existed. Nala said guided you through laboratories filled with genetic sequencing devices, growth acceleration chambers, and monitoring systems that could track biological processes at the molecular level. But it was the meditation chamber that stopped all of you in your tracks. The room was circular, with walls that curved seamlessly into a domed ceiling. The surfaces were covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally, creating an optical effect that was both beautiful and disorienting. In the center stood a single chair clearly designed for humanoid physiology, surrounded by sensor arrays and neural monitoring equipment. This is where we tested the enhanced subject's developing abilities, Nala Se explained, though her tone suggested reluctance to discuss the details. The Omega-07 batch displayed increasing sensitivity to what you might call environmental fluctuations. They could predict equipment failures, sense approaching storms, and most remarkably, they began to demonstrate awareness of events occurring beyond their immediate sensory range. Kix approached the chair with obvious recognition. "I've seen rooms like this before," he said quietly. "Not exactly the same, but similar. Some of my brothers described being brought to places where they were tested, evaluated, measured. Most of them thought it was standard medical screening. But now I wonder if it was something else entirely." Master Nu was examining the sensor arrays with growing fascination and concern. "These readings," she said, pointing to data displays that were still active, "they're measuring midi-chlorian activity. But the levels shown here are far beyond what should be possible for non-force sensitive individuals. If these measurements are accurate, the enhanced clones were displaying force sensitivity that rivaled trained Jedi. The implications hit all of you simultaneously. An army of force-sensitive clones would have changed the entire nature of the Clone Wars. They would have been able to sense Sith influence, predict enemy movements, and potentially resist the control systems that made Order 66 possible. But they would also have been impossible to control, unpredictable in ways that threatened the carefully orchestrated plan that was manipulating the galaxy toward empire. Nala Se's next words confirmed your growing suspicions. The termination order came directly from Supreme Chancellor Palpatine's office, not from the Jedi Council, not from Republic Military Command, but from the Chancellor himself. The enhanced clones were deemed a security risk of the highest priority. All subjects were to be recalled immediately and processed for disposal. But as you would soon discover, not all of the Ghost Battalion had answered that final recall order. Some had sensed the trap waiting for them, and chosen a different path. Their story was scattered across the galaxy in hidden archives, encrypted communications, and the memories of clones who had learned to question orders that felt wrong in their souls. The rain continued to fall on Camino as you prepared to leave the research facility, but now each drop seemed to carry whispers of secrets that had been buried beneath oceans of official denial. The Ghost Battalion's trail was growing clearer, and it led away from this world of endless storms toward destinations that would challenge everything you thought you knew about the Clone Wars and the forces that had shaped its outcome. The encrypted files you discovered in the abandoned Kaminoan research facility painted a picture that defied everything the Republic had claimed about clone production. Hidden within layers of genetic sequencing data and biological monitoring reports, you found evidence of modifications that went far beyond enhanced reflexes or improved tactical awareness. The Omega-07 batch had been subjected to genetic alterations that seemed designed to awaken dormant pathways in human consciousness itself. Master Nu worked tirelessly during your return journey to Coruscant, her expertise in ancient languages proving crucial as she decoded the Kaminoan research notes. The process was painstaking, as the scientists had embedded their most sensitive findings within cultural databases and historical records. But gradually, a startling truth emerged from the fragments of data. They weren't trying to create better soldiers, Master Nu said on the third day of your journey back. They were attempting to artificially induce force sensitivity in the clone population. The genetic modifications to batch Omega-07 were designed to unlock what the Kaminoans believed were latent pathways present in all human genetic material. The implications were staggering. If the Kaminoans had succeeded in creating force-sensitive clones on a large scale, the entire balance of the galaxy would have shifted. An army of soldiers who could predict enemy movements, sense deception, and resist mental manipulation would have been unstoppable. But it would also have been uncontrollable by anyone seeking to use them for purposes that contradicted the Force's natural flow. Kix had been unusually quiet during the journey, spending long hours in meditation that seemed to grow deeper and more focused each day. When he finally shared what he had discovered through his connection to his brothers, his revelation added new urgency to your investigation. I've been in contact with survivors from units that served alongside the enhanced clones, he reported. They remember battles that don't appear in any official records, engagements where their brothers seemed to know exactly where enemy fire would come from, where they could sense ambushes before they were sprung, where they moved with coordination that went beyond anything their training could explain. The survivors' accounts painted a picture of the Ghost Battalion that was both inspiring and tragic. These enhanced clones had quickly discovered that their new abilities came with a price. They began experiencing shared dreams that spanned across star systems, visions of possible futures that were often contradictory and confusing. Most troubling of all, they started to question orders that felt wrong, developing a moral compass that sometimes conflicted with military necessity. Back in the Jedi archives, you gained access to even more restricted files, documents that had been sealed by direct order of the Jedi Council. Here you found the first official acknowledgement of what had become known as the Omega Incident. Though the details remained heavily classified, the incident had occurred during a routine patrol mission in the Outer Rim, when an entire battalion of enhanced clones had apparently experienced simultaneous force visions of a coming betrayal. The battalion commander, a clone designated Alpha 117, but known to his brothers as Havoc, had filed a report that was immediately classified and buried. According to his account, every enhanced clone in his unit had experienced the same vision simultaneously. They had seen themselves turning their weapons on their Jedi commanders, following orders that came from someone they trusted but could no longer identify as ally rather than enemy. The vision had been so vivid and disturbing that Havoc had requested immediate consultation with the Jedi Council. But before any response could be arranged, new orders had arrived from Supreme Chancellor Palpatine's office. The entire battalion was to be recalled to Kamino for routine medical evaluation and enhancement adjustment. What happened next was where the official records ended, and the mystery deepened. According to Republic databases, the enhanced clones had complied with their recall orders and been processed for standard medical procedures. But Kix's contacts among surviving clone veterans told a different story entirely. Some of them never made it to the transport ships. Kix revealed as you studied the contradictory accounts. Brothers who served with the enhanced units said they just disappeared one night. Their gear was left behind. Their posts were abandoned. But there were no signs of struggle or enemy action. It was as if they had simply chosen to vanish. The investigation led you to examine communication logs from Republic ships operating in the Outer Rim during the relevant time period. Here, buried in routine status reports and maintenance schedules, you found fragments of encrypted transmissions that painted a picture of organized resistance rather than simple desertion. The enhanced clones had indeed received the recall orders, but their force sensitivity had allowed them to perceive the true nature of what awaited them on Camino. Rather than comply with orders they knew would lead to their destruction, they had chosen to disappear into the vast anonymity of a galaxy at war. Some had gone into deep cover among regular clone units. Others had sought refuge in the criminal underworld or remote frontier systems. And a few had apparently chosen a path that would bring them into direct conflict with the forces manipulating the Clone Wars from the shadows. The deeper you dug into the mystery, the more you realized that the Ghost Battalion's story was intricately connected to the broader conspiracy that was reshaping the galaxy. The enhanced clones hadn't just developed force sensitivity, they had developed the ability to perceive the dark side influences that were corrupting the Republic from within. Their disappearance hadn't been a military failure or a case of simple desertion. It had been a desperate attempt to preserve knowledge that could expose the true nature of the Clone Wars. Master Nu's research into ancient Jedi prophecies provided additional context that was both illuminating and deeply troubling. References to a chosen army appeared in texts that predated the Republic by thousands of years, but these prophecies had always been interpreted as referring to the Jedi Order itself. Now, with the discovery of Force-sensitive clones, the meaning seemed far more literal and immediate. The prophecies speak of soldiers who would arise in the galaxy's darkest hour, Master Nu explained as she shared her findings. Warriors who were born from one source but would choose their own destinies. The ancient texts warn that these chosen soldiers would face a terrible choice between loyalty to their creators and loyalty to the Force itself. The pattern was becoming clear, but it raised questions that struck at the heart of everything the Jedi believed about the Clone Wars. If the enhanced clones had been able to sense the coming betrayal that would become Order 66, why hadn't the Jedi Council heeded their warnings? If these soldiers possessed force sensitivity that could have exposed Sith manipulation, why were they terminated rather than embraced as allies? The answers, you were beginning to realize, lay not in the official records of the Republic or the hidden files of Camino, but in the scattered testimonies of survivors who had witnessed the Ghost Battalion's final stand. These enhanced clones hadn't simply disappeared into the galaxy. They had gathered somewhere in the Outer Rim, in a place that official star charts didn't acknowledge, for a confrontation that would determine whether their knowledge would survive to warn future generations. The trail was leading you toward a world that existed in the spaces between official navigation routes, a place where 10,000 enhanced clones had made their last stand against forces that sought to erase them from history. But finding that world would require more than archived data and decoded files. It would require following the whispers that still echoed through the Force, the voices of soldiers who had discovered they possessed souls worth dying to protect. The pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together with disturbing clarity as you compiled your findings in the depths of the Jedi archives. The enhanced clones of Batch Omega-07 had developed force sensitivity that allowed them to perceive the Sith manipulation corrupting the Republic. Their recall to Camino had been a death sentence disguised as routine medical evaluation. The official explanation was clean, logical, and completely satisfactory to anyone who didn't look too closely at the details. Master Nu had spent weeks cross-referencing the disappeared clones with casualty reports from the Outer Rim campaigns. According to Republic records, the enhanced units had been lost in a series of separatist ambushes that had been particularly devastating due to unexpected enemy intelligence. The battles had been fierce but brief, with few survivors and even fewer recoverable remains. The paperwork was thorough. The explanations were plausible, and the case was officially closed. But Kix's connections to the clone veteran network had revealed inconsistencies that couldn't be dismissed. Brothers who had served alongside the enhanced clones reported receiving final transmissions that contradicted the official timeline. These messages, sent through encrypted clone communication channels, described a coordinated withdrawal rather than a military disaster. The enhanced clones hadn't been ambushed by separatist forces. They had deliberately disengaged from Republic command structure and vanished into uncharted space. The breakthrough came when you discovered a series of requisition orders that had been processed through Republic supply chains during the relevant time period. Someone had been stockpiling medical supplies, food rations, and defensive equipment in quantities that suggested preparation for a long-term siege. The orders had been placed using valid Republic authorization codes, but the delivery coordinates led to empty space according to official navigation charts. Commander Kix studied the supply manifests with growing recognition. "These aren't random purchases," he observed. "Someone was preparing to establish a self-sufficient base capable of supporting a large population for an extended period. The medical supplies alone suggest they were planning to treat force-related injuries and psychological trauma on a massive scale." The implications were staggering. The enhanced clones hadn't simply deserted their posts and scattered across the galaxy. They had organized a coordinated evacuation to a predetermined location where they could continue their resistance to the forces that sought to destroy them. More importantly, they had been preparing to preserve their knowledge about the Sith manipulation of the Clone Wars. Master Nu's research into ancient star charts revealed the existence of a star system that had been deliberately removed from modern navigation databases. The system, once known as Vos Ka, had been the site of an ancient force nexus that early Jedi explorers had deemed too dangerous for regular contact. The planet had been quarantined for thousands of years, its location classified at the highest levels of Jedi authority. The ancient records describe Vos Ka as a world where the Force flows in patterns that amplify both light and dark side energies. Master Nu explained as she shared her findings. Jedi who spent extended time there reported enhanced abilities but also increased susceptibility to emotional extremes. The planet was eventually abandoned because it was too unpredictable for safe study. The choice of Vos Ka as a refuge made perfect sense for Force-sensitive clones who were fleeing persecution. The planet's unique properties would enhance their abilities while providing natural concealment from anyone trying to track them through the Force. But it would also be incredibly dangerous, especially for individuals whose Force sensitivity was artificially induced and potentially unstable. Your investigation took a new direction when Kix received a message through clone communication channels that had supposedly been shut down years earlier. The transmission was brief, heavily encrypted, and carried authentication codes that identified it as coming from the Ghost Battalion itself. The message contained coordinates for a meeting point in the Mid-Rim and a simple request: "Truth seekers welcome. Bring proof of pure intent." The journey to the rendezvous coordinates took you to a seemingly abandoned mining station in the Sullust system. The facility appeared to have been derelict for decades, its docking bays empty and its communication arrays dark. But as your transport approached, hidden sensors activated and guided you to a concealed landing platform deep within the asteroid field. The clone who met you there bore the weathered features of a veteran, but his eyes held depth that seemed to go beyond normal human experience. He identified himself as CT-3636, though he said his brothers called him Wolf. Unlike the clones you had encountered before, Wolf moved with a fluid grace that suggested enhanced awareness of his surroundings. "You've been asking questions about the Ghost Battalion," Wolf said without preamble. "The kind of questions that get people disappeared if they ask them in the wrong places. But Kix vouches for your intentions, and we've been watching your investigation with interest." The conversation that followed revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had shaped the Clone Wars. The enhanced clones hadn't just developed force sensitivity, they had developed the ability to perceive the network of Sith influence that was manipulating events across the galaxy. They had seen through the deceptions that had fooled even the Jedi Council, recognizing Palpatine's true nature long before Order 66 made it obvious to everyone else. "We tried to warn the Jedi," Wolf explained as he led you through the mining station's restored corridors. "Alpha 117 filed dozens of reports about the visions we were experiencing. We documented instances of Sith manipulation, provided evidence of the conspiracy, gave detailed accounts of how the war was being orchestrated to serve dark side purposes. But every report was classified, buried, or dismissed as combat stress. The mining station had been converted into a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. Banks of computers monitored Republic communications, tracked troop movements, and analyzed political developments across the galaxy. But more impressively, the facility contained archives of information that the enhanced clones had gathered about the true nature of the Clone Wars. "We've been documenting everything," Wolf continued, "showing you storage banks filled with data crystals and holocron recordings. Every instance of Sith manipulation, every piece of evidence that proves the war is being orchestrated, every detail about how the clone armies were designed not just to fight the Separatists, but to eventually destroy the Jedi. We knew that if we were terminated, this knowledge would die with us." The records were comprehensive and damning. They showed how Palpatine had manipulated both sides of the conflict, how the enhanced clones' termination had been ordered to prevent them from exposing the conspiracy, and how Order 66 was just the final phase of a plan that had been in motion since the beginning of the war. But they also revealed something that official histories had missed entirely. The Ghost Battalion hadn't been wiped out in separatist ambushes. They had been hunted down by clone troopers who were operating under direct orders from Palpatine himself. The enhanced clones' force sensitivity had made them impossible to control through normal means, so they had been eliminated by their own brothers who were still following their programming without question. "Most of us died fighting clones who looked exactly like us," Wolf said quietly. "Brothers who had been conditioned to follow orders without understanding what those orders really meant. It was the cruelest irony of all. We had gained the ability to see the truth, but that truth made us enemies of everything we had been created to serve." The revelation was devastating, but it explained why the official records had been so carefully constructed to hide the truth. The Ghost Battalion's destruction hadn't been a military necessity, or even a cover-up of failed experiments. It had been the elimination of witnesses who could have prevented the rise of the Empire by exposing Palpatine's conspiracy before it reached its conclusion. But as Wolf would soon reveal, not all of the enhanced clones had died in those final battles. A few had survived, scattered across the galaxy, preserving their knowledge and waiting for the right moment to share what they knew with those who would listen. The hidden archives within the mining station revealed a conspiracy far more complex and devastating than anything you had imagined. Wolf guided you through chambers filled with evidence that painted a picture of systematic manipulation spanning decades. The enhanced clones hadn't just stumbled upon fragments of Sith influence, they had uncovered an intricate web of deception that reached into every aspect of the Clone Wars. The visions started small, Wolf explained as he activated holographic displays, showing battle formations and political movements across the galaxy. Individual clones would dream of events before they happened, sense ambushes before they were sprung, feel the emotional states of enemies they had never encountered. Command dismissed it as combat intuition, but we knew it was something more. The data crystals contained hundreds of hours of testimony, from enhanced clones who had documented their experiences before their apparent deaths. Their accounts described a gradual awakening to abilities that went far beyond enhanced reflexes or tactical awareness. They had begun to perceive what they called the Great Deception, a vast pattern of manipulation that was steering the galaxy toward a predetermined outcome. Master Nu studied the testimonies with growing fascination and horror. The enhanced clones had developed not just force sensitivity, but a unique form of collective consciousness that allowed them to share insights across vast distances. When one clone discovered evidence of Sith manipulation, that knowledge became available to every other member of Batch Omega-07 regardless of their physical location. They were becoming something unprecedented, Master Nu observed as she reviewed the psychological evaluations the clones had conducted on themselves. Not individual Force users like Jedi or Sith, but a networked intelligence capable of perceiving patterns that span the entire galaxy. No wonder Palpatine ordered their termination. They represented a threat to his plans that he couldn't control or predict. The journey to their final refuge had been a masterpiece of coordination and deception. Rather than fleeing in panic when they received their recall orders, the enhanced clones had implemented a carefully planned extraction that had been months in preparation. Using their network of shared consciousness, they had identified which Republic units could be trusted and which had been compromised by Sith influence. Kix listened to these accounts with visible emotion, recognizing the voices of brothers he had thought were dead. Rex always said that something felt wrong about the war, he said quietly. He couldn't put his finger on it. But there were patterns that didn't make sense, orders that felt like they were serving someone else's purposes. Now I understand why. The enhanced clones were trying to warn us, but we weren't enhanced enough to hear what they were really saying. The mining station served as more than just an archive of evidence. It was a way station on the path to Voska, the hidden world where the surviving members of the Ghost Battalion had established their final sanctuary. Wolf explained that the journey to Voska required special preparation, as the planet's unique force properties could be overwhelming for individuals who weren't properly prepared. The planet amplifies everything, Wolf warned as he began preparing navigation data for your continued journey. Emotions become more intense, force abilities are magnified, and the line between light and dark becomes harder to maintain. That's why the ancient Jedi quarantined it. But for us, it was the only place where we could hide from Palpatine's hunters while developing our abilities enough to preserve our knowledge. The preparation for the journey to Voska involved more than just navigation planning. Wolf insisted that you undergo meditation training designed to help non-enhanced individuals cope with the planet's intense force environment. The techniques were based on practices the enhanced clones had developed to manage their artificially induced abilities. Your minds work differently than ours, Wolf explained as he guided you through breathing exercises that seemed designed to create internal calm. We were built from the same genetic template, conditioned to think in similar patterns, programmed to respond to situations in predictable ways. When the enhancements awakened our force sensitivity, we had to learn to think as individuals while maintaining our connection to each other. You'll need similar mental discipline to survive what you'll encounter on Voska. The meditation sessions revealed aspects of force training that weren't taught in the Jedi Temple, where Jedi techniques focused on individual mastery and connection to the universal force. The enhanced clones had developed methods for maintaining shared consciousness while preserving personal identity. It was a delicate balance that required constant attention and mutual support. Master Nu participated in these sessions with obvious struggle. Her lifetime of Jedi training had prepared her for individual Force connection, but the collective consciousness techniques used by the enhanced clones challenged fundamental assumptions about how the Force operated. It's like trying to speak a language that uses multiple voices simultaneously, she observed. Beautiful but almost incomprehensible to minds trained in more traditional approaches. The deeper implications of the enhanced clone's abilities became clear as you prepared for the journey to Voska. Their collective consciousness hadn't just allowed them to share tactical information or emotional support. It had enabled them to perceive the overall pattern of Sith manipulation with a clarity that individual Force users couldn't achieve. They had seen the Clone Wars not as a series of separate conflicts but as a single, coordinated campaign, designed to destroy both the Jedi Order and the Republic simultaneously. We could feel Palpatine's influence even when he wasn't physically present, Wolf revealed during one of the meditation sessions. His emotional signature was woven through every major decision, every strategic choice, every political development. But it was subtle, hidden beneath layers of legitimate concerns and reasonable justifications. Individual Jedi might sense something wrong, but they couldn't perceive the overall pattern. We could. The evidence archived in the mining station included detailed analyses of specific battles and political events that revealed the extent of Sith manipulation. The enhanced clones had tracked how information was selectively shared or withheld, how resources were allocated to serve hidden purposes, and how key personnel were positioned to influence outcomes according to Palpatine's design. But perhaps most disturbing were the records of their attempts to share this knowledge with Republic leadership. The enhanced clones had compiled comprehensive reports, complete with supporting evidence and strategic recommendations. They had identified Sith agents within the Republic government, documented instances of deliberate sabotage, and provided warnings about specific threats to Jedi safety. Every report had been classified, buried, or dismissed. In some cases, clones who had submitted particularly detailed warnings had been reassigned to high-risk missions from which they never returned. The pattern was clear. The Republic's leadership either couldn't recognize the truth or was actively working to suppress it. The final preparations for departure to Vos K included reviewing the most sensitive files in the archive. These contained the enhanced clones analysis of Order 66, including predictions about its timing and scope that had proven devastatingly accurate. They had known that the Order was coming, had understood its purpose, and had tried desperately to warn the Jedi who would become its victims. "We sent encrypted messages to every Jedi we could reach," Wolf said, as he showed you copies of the warnings that had gone unheeded. "We provided specific details about the control chips, explained how the order would be transmitted, even identified which clone units were most likely to be used in the initial strikes. But the messages were intercepted, blocked, or dismissed as separatist disinformation. As your transport prepared to leave the mining station for the journey to Voska, you carried with you not just the evidence of what had happened to the Ghost Battalion, but the weight of knowledge about how their warnings could have prevented one of the greatest tragedies in galactic history. The enhanced clones had possessed the ability to see the truth, but the galaxy had been structured to ensure that truth couldn't be heard by those who needed to hear it most. The journey to their final sanctuary would reveal whether their sacrifice had preserved something valuable enough to justify the price they had paid for their unique awareness. The hyperspace journey to Voska felt different from any you had experienced before. Even while traveling through the swirling blue tunnel between stars, you could sense something unusual about your destination. The Force itself seemed to grow stronger as you approached the hidden world, creating an almost tangible presence that filled the ship's corridors with subtle energy. Wolf spent the journey sharing stories about the enhanced clones who had made this same trip years earlier, fleeing the systematic extermination that had claimed most of their brothers. His accounts painted a picture of soldiers who had discovered something profound about their own nature, only to find that discovery made them enemies of the very republic they had been created to serve. The first groups to reach Voska were barely functional. Wolf recalled as he monitored the navigation systems. The artificial enhancement of their force sensitivity had created mental strain that their genetic programming couldn't handle. Some were experiencing constant visions of possible futures. Others were overwhelmed by emotional connections to clones scattered across the galaxy. A few had developed abilities so intense that they couldn't distinguish between their own thoughts and the collective consciousness of their brothers. Master Nu listened to these accounts with the focused attention of a scholar studying a completely new form of force manifestation. The enhanced clones had experienced abilities that didn't fit into traditional categories of Jedi or Sith powers. Their collective consciousness represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a form of force connection that transcended individual awareness while maintaining personal identity. The ancient texts describe similar phenomena among certain species that evolved in force-rich environments, she observed. But those were natural developments that occurred over thousands of generations. What the Kaminoans accomplished with the enhanced clones was the artificial creation of a group consciousness in beings whose genetics weren't naturally adapted for such experiences. The dropout of hyperspace near Voska revealed a world that seemed to pulse with visible energy. The planet appeared normal at first glance, covered in forests and oceans that reflected the light of its star in familiar patterns. But as your sensors collected more detailed data, anomalies became apparent. Energy readings fluctuated in ways that suggested massive force concentrations, and the planet's magnetic field displayed patterns that defied conventional physics. Kix had been unusually quiet during the journey. But as Voska filled the viewports, he began describing sensations that echoed the experiences of his enhanced brothers. "I can feel them," he said softly. "Not just the survivors who are still alive, but echoes of all the clones who died trying to reach this place. Their experiences, their memories, their final thoughts. It's like the planet itself has absorbed their consciousness and preserved it somehow." The landing approach required careful navigation through energy fields that could disrupt ship systems. Wolf guided your transport along a specific vector that he had memorized during his previous visits, following a path that avoided the most intense force concentrations. Even so, the ship's instruments registered readings that would have been impossible anywhere else in the galaxy. The surface of Voska was beautiful in a way that seemed almost artificial. The forests glowed with subtle bioluminescence, their leaves catching and reflecting ambient force energy in patterns that created natural light shows. Rivers flowed with water so pure it seemed to sing with harmonic vibrations. The very air was charged with energy that made every breath feel revitalizing. But beneath the beauty lay something more complex and potentially dangerous. The force flowed through Voska in currents that amplified emotional states and enhanced psychic abilities beyond normal limits. For individuals trained in traditional force disciplines, the planet could be overwhelming. For artificially enhanced clones whose abilities were already unstable, it could be either salvation or destruction. The settlement that the Ghost Battalion had established occupied a natural clearing surrounded by ancient trees whose trunks bore carvings from previous inhabitants. The structures were simple but elegant, built from local materials that seemed to harmonize with the planet's energy fields. Gardens and meditation spaces were integrated throughout the community, creating an environment designed for both physical survival and spiritual development. The enhanced clones who greeted your arrival moved with the fluid grace of beings who had learned to work in harmony with their environment. Their eyes held depth that spoke of experiences beyond normal human comprehension. But they also displayed the disciplined focus of soldiers who had never abandoned their commitment to protecting others. Alpha 117, the clone known as Havoc, who had filed the first official reports about the enhanced abilities, had become the de facto leader of the survivors. His presence radiated calm authority, but there was something else about him that was immediately apparent. He had developed force abilities that rivaled those of trained Jedi Masters, yet his approach to using those abilities was fundamentally different from traditional Jedi techniques. "Welcome to Sanctuary," Havoc said, as he led you through the settlement. "We've been expecting you for some time. The collective consciousness that connects us allows us to perceive significant events before they occur, and your investigation has been creating ripples in the Force that we could sense from across the galaxy." The tour of the settlement revealed how the enhanced clones had adapted to life on Voska. They had learned to channel the planet's intense force energies into practical applications, growing crops with enhanced vitality, purifying water through force manipulation, and maintaining technology through methods that blended engineering with force abilities. But more importantly, they had used their time in exile to develop their collective consciousness into something that approached true wisdom. The individual enhancement that the Kaminoans gave us was just the beginning. Havoc explained as he showed you meditation chambers where groups of clones practiced shared consciousness techniques. Living here, surrounded by force energy that amplifies everything we think and feel, we've learned to function as something greater than the sum of our individual selves. We've become a living repository of knowledge about the Clone Wars and the forces that shape them. The archives that the Ghost Battalion had established on Voska made the collections on the mining station seem primitive by comparison. Here, information wasn't just stored in data crystals and holocrons. The enhanced clones had learned to embed knowledge directly into the planet's force fields, creating a living library that could be accessed through meditation and shared consciousness techniques. Master Nu was overwhelmed by the scope and sophistication of what the clones had accomplished. "They've created something unprecedented," she whispered, as she observed the meditation sessions where multiple clones shared memories and insights simultaneously. Not just an archive of information, but a form of collective wisdom that grows and evolves as new understanding is added to it. The deeper purpose of the Ghost Battalion's sanctuary became clear as you participated in their sharing sessions. They weren't just preserving evidence of Sith manipulation during the Clone Wars. They were developing understanding of how such manipulation could be prevented in the future. Their collective consciousness allowed them to perceive patterns of deception and control that individual minds couldn't recognize. But perhaps most importantly, they had discovered something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. The artificial enhancement of their force sensitivity had revealed that awareness, identity, and free will were more complex and resilient than their creators had believed. Even beings bred for absolute obedience could choose their own destinies when they developed the wisdom to understand what those choices really meant. "We were created to be identical, predictable, controllable," Havoc observed as the sun set over Voska, painting the sky in colors that seemed to pulse with force energy. "But consciousness has a way of transcending the limitations that others try to impose on it. We learn to think as individuals while remaining connected to each other. We discovered that true loyalty isn't blind obedience, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for principles worth preserving." The night brought new revelations as the planet's force energies shifted with the changing light. In the darkness, Voska's bioluminescent forests created a natural cathedral of living light, where the enhanced clones gathered to share the deepest insights of their collective consciousness. Here, in this temple made of living force energy, you would learn the ultimate truth about what had really happened to the Ghost Battalion and why their story mattered for the future of the galaxy. The gathering in Voska's bioluminescent cathedral revealed truths that shattered everything you thought you understood about the Clone Wars and the forces that had shaped galactic history. As the enhanced clones shared their collective memories through the planet's amplified force fields, a devastating revelation emerged from the depths of their preserved consciousness. The Ghost Battalion hadn't just discovered evidence of Sith manipulation within the Republic. They had uncovered proof that the entire clone army project had been designed from its inception as a weapon against the Jedi Order. Every aspect of clone creation, from the genetic modifications to the behavioral conditioning, had been planned to serve Palpatine's ultimate goal of destroying the Guardians of Peace and Justice. Havoc stood at the center of the luminous grove, his consciousness connected to every other enhanced clone present. As he began to share memories that had been carefully preserved since the early days of the war, the revelation came to us gradually, he explained, his voice carrying the weight of profound sorrow mixed with terrible understanding. Individual visions, shared dreams, fragments of awareness that slowly formed a complete picture of the deception that had consumed our entire existence. The enhanced clones had discovered that Jango Fett's selection as the genetic template for the clone army hadn't been random or based purely on his combat abilities. Fett had been chosen specifically because his genetic material contained certain characteristics that made it particularly susceptible to Sith influence. Hidden within his DNA were markers that could be activated through specific conditioning techniques, creating pathways for external control that bypassed conscious resistance. We were bred to be weapons against the Jedi. Havoc continued, his connection to the collective consciousness allowing him to share not just memories but the emotional weight of that terrible knowledge. Every clone carried within his genetic structure the potential for betrayal. The behavioral conditioning we received as cadets wasn't just military training. It was psychological preparation for the moment when we would be called upon to destroy the beings we had been taught to serve. Master Nu listened to these revelations with visible horror, her lifetime of Jedi training, unable to prepare her for the scope of the deception that had been perpetrated. The implications went far beyond simple political manipulation. The clone army represented a form of genetic slavery that had been designed to corrupt the very foundations of galactic civilization. But the enhanced clones had discovered something even more disturbing. Their artificial force sensitivity had allowed them to perceive the true nature of Order 66 before it was ever implemented. The command wasn't simply a military directive transmitted through communication channels. It was an activation signal that triggered genetic programming embedded within every clone's consciousness. The control chips were just the final fail-safe. Havoc explained as the collective memory revealed the full horror of what had been done to the clone army. The real control mechanism was written into our genetic code from the moment of our creation. Every clone carried within his DNA the compulsion to obey certain commands regardless of personal loyalty or moral conviction. Order 66 simply activated programming that had been there all along. Kix experienced these shared memories with the unique perspective of a clone who had retained his individual identity while developing awareness of the collective consciousness. His reaction was visceral and immediate, as if he could feel the genetic programming stirring within his own mind even as he learned to resist its influence. Rex always fought against orders that felt wrong, Kix said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He would question strategies that didn't make sense, challenge decisions that seemed to serve no tactical purpose. Now I understand what he was really fighting against. That's what he was really fighting against. He was struggling against his own genetic programming, using pure force of will to maintain his independence. The enhanced clones had learned to perceive the genetic control mechanisms through their collective consciousness, and more importantly, they had developed techniques for resisting that control. Their artificial force sensitivity had given them the awareness necessary to recognize when their programming was being activated and their shared consciousness had allowed them to support each other in maintaining individual identity despite genetic compulsion. The Kaminoans never intended for us to develop this level of awareness. Havoc observed as he shared memories of the early enhancement experiments. They were trying to create better soldiers, more effective weapons against the separatists. But in awakening our connection to the Force, they inadvertently gave us the tools necessary to perceive and resist the very control mechanisms they had helped to create. The revelation that followed was perhaps the most devastating of all. The enhanced clones had attempted to share their knowledge with other clone units, hoping to help their brothers develop similar resistance to genetic programming. But every attempt at communication had been monitored and intercepted by Sith agents within the Republic military structure. Rather than being allowed to spread awareness that could have prevented Order 66, the enhanced clones had been systematically hunted down and eliminated, not by separatist forces as the official records claimed, but by other clone units that were specifically conditioned to view the enhanced clones as traitors and security threats. We watched our brothers turn against us. Havoc shared, his consciousness carrying the emotional weight of that terrible experience to everyone present. Clones who looked exactly like us, who shared our genetic template and our training, who followed orders to hunt us down without understanding what those orders really meant. They had been programmed to see our awareness as a form of mental illness that threatened military effectiveness. The systematic elimination of the enhanced clones had been carried out with ruthless efficiency. Clone units that showed signs of questioning orders or developing independent thinking were reassigned to high-risk missions. Individuals who demonstrated unusual awareness or sensitivity were subjected to medical evaluations that resulted in memory modification or outright termination. But perhaps most horrifically, the enhanced clones had discovered that their persecution was being used as a testing ground for the techniques that would eventually be employed in Order 66 itself. The methods used to turn clone against clone were refined and perfected through the campaign against the Ghost Battalion, creating a template for the systematic betrayal that would destroy the Jedi Order. They used us to perfect the art of betrayal, Havoc revealed. His consciousness sharing images of battles, where enhanced clones had been forced to fight their own brothers. Every engagement taught them more about how to manipulate clone psychology, how to overcome natural loyalty through genetic compulsion, how to ensure that personal bonds couldn't interfere with programmed objectives. The enhanced clones, who had managed to escape to Vos Ka, represented the survivors of a campaign of genocide that had been hidden within the larger context of the Clone Wars. They had preserved not just evidence of Sith manipulation, but proof of how that manipulation had been tested and refined through the systematic destruction of their own kind. Master Nu struggled to process the implications of what she was learning. The Jedi Order had unknowingly participated in their own destruction by accepting the clone army as allies and protectors. Every battle fought alongside clone troopers had been training those same soldiers for the moment when they would become executioners. The tragedy isn't just what happened to the Jedi during Order 66, she observed, her voice heavy with newfound understanding. The tragedy is that an entire army of sentient beings was bred and conditioned to betray everything they believed they stood for. The clones were victims of the same deception that destroyed the Jedi Order. But as the night deepened, and Vos Ka's force energies reached their peak intensity, the enhanced clones would reveal that their story contained more than just tragedy and betrayal. Hidden within their collective consciousness was knowledge that could prevent such manipulation from ever succeeding again. Wisdom that had been purchased with the sacrifice of 10,000 brothers who had chosen awareness over obedience. The deeper layers of the enhanced clones' collective memory revealed a conspiracy that spanned not just the Clone Wars, but generations of Sith manipulation, stretching back to the fall of the Old Republic. As the bioluminescent forest pulsed with Force energy around you, Havoc guided the sharing session into memories that had been preserved from the very beginning of the clone project. The Sith had been planning this for 1,000 years, Havoc shared, his consciousness connecting with the preserved experiences of clones who had served in the earliest battles of the war. Every major galactic conflict, every political crisis, every shift in the balance of power had been orchestrated to create the conditions necessary for their ultimate victory. The clone army wasn't conceived during the Separatist crisis. It was the culmination of a plan that began when Darth Bane established the Rule of Two. The enhanced clones had discovered evidence of Sith influence in historical events that predated the Clone Wars by centuries. Through their collective consciousness, they had perceived patterns of manipulation that individual historians and Jedi scholars had missed. Wars had been started and ended according to Sith design. Political movements had been guided by dark side influence. Even the Jedi Order's own evolution had been subtly shaped by enemies who understood patience as a weapon. Master Nu absorbed these revelations with the shock of someone whose entire understanding of galactic history was being rewritten. The signs were there, she admitted, as the collective memory revealed documents and artifacts that took on new meaning in light of the enhanced clones' insights. References to hidden influences, unexplained political shifts, patterns that seemed random but served consistent purposes. We interpreted them as natural historical development, but they were actually evidence of systematic manipulation. The scope of the deception was staggering. The Sith hadn't simply corrupted the Republic during the Clone Wars. They had been shaping galactic civilization for generations, creating the conditions that would make their final victory inevitable. The clone army represented the perfect synthesis of their long-term planning, combining genetic control, psychological manipulation, and military necessity into a weapon that could destroy their enemies while appearing to serve them. But the enhanced clones had discovered something that their Sith manipulators hadn't anticipated. The artificial awakening of force sensitivity in genetically identical beings had created a form of consciousness that could perceive patterns across timescales that exceeded individual lifespans. Their collective awareness had allowed them to see the full scope of Sith manipulation in ways that even the Jedi Council couldn't achieve. We became something they hadn't planned for. Havoc explained as the sharing session revealed memories of the enhanced clones' growing awareness. Individual Jedi could sense disturbances in the Force, but they couldn't perceive the overall pattern because their awareness was limited to their own lifespans. Our collective consciousness allowed us to experience history as a continuous flow, seeing connections across generations that revealed the true scope of Sith planning. The enhanced clones had used their unique perspective to trace the bloodlines and power structures that the Sith had been manipulating for centuries. They had identified families whose genetic heritage carried markers of force sensitivity that could be exploited for dark side purposes. They had tracked the accumulation of wealth and political influence that had been carefully orchestrated to serve Sith objectives. Most importantly, they had mapped the network of agents and supporters that had been positioned throughout galactic society to ensure the success of the final plan. Kix participated in the collective memory, with growing understanding of his own place in the larger conspiracy. We were all part of it. He realized as the shared consciousness revealed the extent of genetic manipulation that had gone into clone creation. Not just the enhanced clones, but every trooper in the Grand Army. We were designed to be the perfect weapons against the Jedi because our creators understood exactly what would be required to overcome Force-sensitive opponents. The revelation went deeper than simple genetic programming. The enhanced clones had discovered that their creation involved knowledge of the Force that the Kaminoans shouldn't have possessed. The genetic modifications that had been introduced into the clone template had been based on Sith research into the nature of consciousness and identity. The clones hadn't just been bred for obedience. They had been designed to be vulnerable to specific forms of force manipulation that would make them ideal instruments of betrayal. The Kaminoans were never the real architects of our creation, Havoc shared his collective consciousness, revealing memories of conversations and documents that had been hidden from official records. They were skilled geneticists, but they lacked the understanding of force dynamics that would have been necessary to create beings capable of betraying force users. That knowledge came from Sith research that had been accumulating for generations. The enhanced clones had traced the sources of this knowledge through historical records and force echoes that they could perceive through their collective consciousness. Ancient Sith experiments with genetic manipulation had provided the foundation for techniques that were refined and perfected over centuries. The clone army represented the culmination of research that had been conducted in secret laboratories and hidden facilities throughout the galaxy's dark age. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the Jedi Order itself had unknowingly contributed to the research that would eventually be used to destroy them. Historical records revealed instances where Jedi healers and researchers had shared knowledge with scientists who were secretly working for Sith interests. Medical techniques developed to help force-sensitive individuals had been perverted into methods for controlling and manipulating consciousness on a genetic level. The Jedi's greatest strength became their greatest weakness, Master Nu observed, as she processed the implications of the enhanced clones' discoveries. Their commitment to helping others, their willingness to share knowledge for the greater good, their trust in the fundamental goodness of sentient beings. All of these qualities were exploited by enemies who understood how to turn virtue into vulnerability. The collective memory revealed specific instances where Jedi knowledge had been corrupted for Sith purposes. Research into midi-chlorian manipulation had been stolen and used to create the genetic modifications that made clones vulnerable to external control. Healing techniques had been perverted into methods for implanting psychological compulsions. Even Jedi philosophical teachings about duty and loyalty had been twisted into justifications for absolute obedience. The enhanced clones had also discovered evidence of how the Sith had protected their long-term plans from detection. Multiple layers of deception had been employed to ensure that even if individual aspects of the conspiracy were uncovered, the overall pattern would remain hidden. Key documents had been destroyed or falsified. Witnesses had been eliminated or their memories modified. Evidence had been scattered across multiple locations and time periods to prevent anyone from assembling a complete picture. They were masters of compartmentalization. Havoc explained as the collective consciousness revealed the sophisticated security measures that had protected Sith planning for generations. Individual agents knew only what they needed to know for their specific roles. Research was divided among multiple facilities that didn't communicate with each other. Even high-ranking Sith apprentices weren't given access to the complete plan until it was too late for them to betray it. But the enhanced clones had found a way to pierce through these layers of deception through their collective consciousness. Their shared awareness had allowed them to gather fragments of information from across the galaxy and assemble them into a coherent understanding of the entire conspiracy. They had become the only beings in galactic history who truly understood the scope and sophistication of the Sith's thousand-year plan. The implications of this knowledge went far beyond historical understanding. The enhanced clones had preserved not just evidence of what had happened, but insights into how such manipulation could be detected and prevented in the future. Their collective consciousness had developed techniques for recognizing the patterns of long-term deception that could protect future generations from similar manipulation. As the night deepened, and Voska's force energies reached their most intense levels, the enhanced clones prepared to share the final and most crucial aspect of their preserved knowledge: the location and nature of Sith resources that had survived the fall of the Empire, and the ongoing threat that these remnants posed to galactic peace. The deepest chambers of the enhanced clones' collective memory contained knowledge that chilled you to your core. As Voska's force energies reached their nocturnal peak, Havoc guided the sharing session into territories that revealed the true scope of what the Ghost Battalion had preserved during their years of exile. The fall of the Emperor wasn't the end. Havoc began, his consciousness merging with the preserved experiences of clones who had witnessed events that official histories claimed never occurred. It was simply the transition from one phase of Sith planning to another. Palpatine's death triggered contingency protocols that had been established centuries before his birth, ensuring that Sith influence would survive even the destruction of the Empire itself. The enhanced clones had discovered that the Sith hadn't simply conquered the galaxy. They had fundamentally transformed it in ways that would persist long after their apparent defeat. Hidden throughout Republic and Imperial space were facilities, resources, and knowledge caches that continued to serve dark-side purposes. More disturbing still, these assets were designed to activate automatically in response to specific galactic conditions, ensuring that Sith influence would resurge whenever the galaxy became vulnerable to manipulation. Master Nu listened to these revelations with growing alarm as she realized the implications for post-Imperial reconstruction efforts. The New Republic isn't just fighting Imperial remnants, she said quietly. They're unknowingly struggling against a system that was designed to perpetuate itself regardless of political changes. Every effort to restore peace and justice is being subtly undermined by mechanisms that were put in place generations ago. The collective consciousness revealed detailed knowledge of sleeper agents who had been positioned throughout galactic society during the height of Imperial power. These individuals weren't simple political loyalists or military officers committed to Imperial ideology. They were beings whose consciousness had been modified through Sith techniques, creating hidden personalities that could be activated to serve dark-side purposes while their surface identities remained completely unaware of their true nature. The most dangerous agents are those who don't know they're agents. Havoc explained as the shared memory revealed the sophisticated psychological conditioning that had been employed. Respected politicians, successful merchants, influential academics, even some who consider themselves supporters of the New Republic, all carrying programming that can transform them into instruments of Sith will whenever the appropriate triggers are activated. Kix experienced these revelations with the unique perspective of someone who understood genetic and psychological manipulation from the inside. It's like the control chips, but more sophisticated, he observed. Instead of simple behavioral commands, they've implanted entire alternate personalities that can emerge when needed. The victims never realize they're being controlled because the control comes from within their own minds. The enhanced clones had spent years mapping the network of hidden assets and sleeper agents that constituted the Sith's long-term survival strategy. Their collective consciousness had allowed them to perceive patterns of influence that spanned multiple star systems and encompassed every level of galactic society. Financial institutions, communication networks, transportation systems, even charitable organizations had been infiltrated and subtly modified to serve dark-side purposes. But perhaps most alarming was the discovery of what the enhanced clones called the heritage sites, locations where Sith knowledge and power had been concentrated and preserved for future use. These weren't simple hideouts or weapons caches, but sophisticated facilities designed to nurture and guide the next generation of dark-side practitioners. Each site contained libraries of forbidden knowledge, training facilities for force manipulation, and most disturbing of all, genetic material that could be used to create new Sith apprentices. The heritage sites represent the true threat to galactic peace. Havoc shared his consciousness, revealing memories of reconnaissance missions that had cost the lives of dozens of enhanced clones. They're not just repositories of Sith knowledge. They're designed to actively seek out and corrupt Force-sensitive individuals, turning potential Jedi into instruments of the dark side. Each site is protected by defenses that go beyond simple technology, using Force-based illusions and psychological manipulation to hide their existence from detection. The collective memory revealed the locations of 17 heritage sites scattered throughout the galaxy, each one positioned to influence a specific region or population center. The enhanced clones had managed to infiltrate and study several of these facilities, gathering intelligence about their operations and defenses. But their investigations had come at a terrible cost, as exposure to concentrated dark side energy had driven some enhanced clones to madness or corruption. Master Nu studied the intelligence about the heritage sites, with the expertise of someone who had spent a lifetime cataloging dangerous knowledge. These facilities represent a form of Sith immortality, she realized. Not the preservation of individual consciousness, but the perpetuation of dark side philosophy and techniques across generations. Even if every current Sith practitioner were eliminated, these sites would continue to create new ones. The enhanced clones had also discovered evidence of a coordination mechanism that connected all the heritage sites and sleeper agents into a unified network. Hidden within the galactic communication grid were protocols that allowed Sith remnants to coordinate their activities without detection. The system was so sophisticated that it could operate for decades without active oversight, automatically adjusting its operations in response to changing galactic conditions. They've created a form of artificial Sith consciousness. Havoc explained as the collective memory revealed the technical specifications of the coordination system. Not truly alive, but capable of making strategic decisions and adapting to circumstances. It monitors galactic politics, identifies opportunities for manipulation, and activates appropriate assets to serve its purposes. In some ways, it's more dangerous than individual Sith Lords because it's patient, systematic, and virtually impossible to detect. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond simple military or political concerns. The enhanced clones had discovered that the coordination system was designed to influence galactic development on a fundamental level, shaping the evolution of civilization itself according to Sith principles. Democratic institutions were subtly undermined. Educational systems were influenced to promote authoritarian thinking, and cultural movements were guided to embrace conflict and division. Kix participated in the sharing session with growing understanding of how these mechanisms had affected his own experiences. The distrust between different clone units, the way we were encouraged to compete rather than cooperate, the subtle messages that made us view civilians as inferior, he realized. All of it was designed to shape our consciousness in ways that would make us more susceptible to dark side influence. The enhanced clones had preserved detailed plans for dismantling the Sith coordination network and neutralizing the heritage sites, but the complexity of the task was staggering. Each facility was protected not just by technological defenses, but by force-based traps that could corrupt or destroy anyone who attempted to interfere with them. The sleeper agents couldn't simply be arrested or eliminated, because most of them were unaware of their conditioning and posed no threat until activated. The solution requires more than military action. Havoc observed as the collective consciousness revealed the full scope of what would be necessary to free the galaxy from Sith influence. It requires a fundamental change in how galactic civilization understands consciousness, identity, and free will. The Sith succeeded because they exploited weaknesses in how beings think about themselves and their relationships to others. The enhanced clones had developed techniques for detecting and countering Sith psychological manipulation. But implementing these methods on a galactic scale would require unprecedented cooperation between diverse populations and institutions. More challenging still, it would require beings to confront uncomfortable truths about how their own thoughts and beliefs had been shaped by hidden influences. As the night reached its deepest point, and Voska's bioluminescent forests created a cathedral of living light around the gathering, the enhanced clones prepared to share their most precious possession, the wisdom they had developed for preserving individual consciousness and free will in the face of systematic manipulation. This knowledge, purchased with the sacrifice of 10,000 brothers, represented hope for a future where such deception could never again threaten galactic peace. The weight of accumulated knowledge pressed down upon the gathering like a physical force as the enhanced clones prepared to share the most dangerous aspects of their preserved consciousness. In the depths of Voska's force-saturated night, where bioluminescent trees cast shifting patterns of light and shadow, the true burden of their awareness became almost overwhelming. Havoc's connection to the collective consciousness deepened as he guided the sharing session into memories that few of the enhanced clones had been willing to preserve. These were the experiences of brothers who had attempted to infiltrate the heritage sites, who had exposed themselves to concentrated dark side energy in order to gather intelligence that could save the galaxy from perpetual manipulation. Some knowledge carries a price that goes beyond death, Havoc began, his voice heavy with the accumulated sorrow of thousands of lost brothers. When we discovered the true scope of Sith planning, we realized that simply preserving evidence wouldn't be enough. Someone had to understand how their systems worked from the inside, even if that understanding destroyed them in the process. The memories that followed were fragmentary and disturbing, filtered through the consciousness of enhanced clones who had subjected themselves to psychological conditioning that mimicked Sith training. These volunteers had allowed themselves to be exposed to dark side corruption in controlled circumstances, hoping to develop immunity to Sith manipulation techniques while gathering intelligence about their operational methods. Most had been lost to madness or corruption, their personalities shattered by exposure to energies that their artificially enhanced consciousness couldn't fully process. But a few had managed to retain enough of their identity to transmit crucial insights back to the collective consciousness before succumbing to the darkness they had infiltrated. Master Nu experienced these shared memories with visible distress, her Jedi training providing little preparation for the psychological horror of witnessing consciousness being deliberately destroyed in service of greater understanding. They sacrificed their souls to save others, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Not their lives, but their very essence, their ability to remain themselves in the face of ultimate corruption. The intelligence gathered through these sacrifices revealed the operational principles that govern Sith manipulation on both individual and galactic scales. The dark side didn't simply corrupt through temptation or fear. It rewrote the fundamental assumptions that beings made about reality, identity, and purpose. Victims weren't simply turned to evil. They were transformed into beings who genuinely believed that their corrupted perspective represented truth and virtue. The most insidious aspect of Sith control is that it makes its victims complicit in their own corruption, Havoc explained, as the collective memory revealed the psychological mechanisms involved. They don't feel enslaved or manipulated. They feel enlightened, empowered, chosen for special understanding. The corruption becomes part of their identity, something they defend as fiercely as they would defend their own children. Kix struggled to process these revelations while maintaining his own psychological equilibrium. The enhanced clone's shared consciousness allowed him to experience fragments of dark side corruption secondhand, providing insight into how such manipulation worked while protecting him from its full effects. But even this limited exposure was almost overwhelming. "I can feel how it works," he said quietly, his voice strained by the effort of maintaining his individual identity while connected to the collective consciousness. "It doesn't attack your beliefs directly. Instead, it subtly shifts the foundations of how you think, changing the criteria you use to evaluate truth and morality. By the time you realize something is wrong, your ability to recognize wrongness has already been compromised." The enhanced clones had discovered that resistance to Sith manipulation required more than simple awareness or strong will. It demanded a fundamental understanding of consciousness itself, along with techniques for maintaining psychological integrity in the face of systematic assault on identity and perception. The collective consciousness that had emerged from their artificial force sensitivity provided natural protection against individual corruption. But it also revealed just how vulnerable isolated minds were to sophisticated manipulation. The heritage sites employed these corruption techniques on an industrial scale, using combinations of force manipulation, psychological conditioning, and environmental influence to transform visitors into instruments of dark side will. The facilities were designed to appear beneficial, offering training and knowledge that seemed to serve legitimate purposes while gradually reshaping the consciousness of those who studied there. The corruption is gradual and voluntary. Havoc shared his connection to the collective memory, revealing the experiences of enhanced clones who had observed these processes. Victims choose each step of their transformation, believing they're making rational decisions based on expanding understanding. By the time they realize they've been manipulated, they've already become manipulators themselves, convinced that spreading their corruption is an act of compassion. The enhanced clones had mapped the psychological techniques employed by each heritage site, documenting how different approaches were used to corrupt different types of individuals. Force-sensitive beings were targeted through their connection to the living energy that permeated the galaxy. Intellectuals were corrupted through exposure to knowledge that seemed profound but gradually warped their ability to distinguish between wisdom and cleverness. Leaders were transformed through techniques that appealed to their desire to protect and guide others. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the heritage sites were actively seeking out and corrupting children. The facilities included educational programs designed to identify force-sensitive younglings and gradually separate them from families and communities that might provide psychological stability. These children were then subjected to training that appeared to develop their abilities while actually programming them for future service to dark side purposes. Master Nu's reaction to this revelation was immediate and visceral. "They're stealing children's futures," she said, her scholarly composure cracking under the weight of accumulated horror. "Not just recruiting them or even corrupting them, but fundamentally altering who they could become. These children will grow up believing that their corrupted perspective represents their natural development." The enhanced clones had attempted to develop countermeasures that could protect individuals and communities from heritage site influence, but the complexity of the challenge was staggering. The corruption was so subtle and gradual that victims often defended their manipulators even after being presented with clear evidence of what was being done to them. Traditional approaches to deprogramming were ineffective because the manipulation operated at levels deeper than conscious belief. The solution that had emerged from the collective consciousness represented a form of psychological inoculation, based on the enhanced clone's own experience of maintaining individual identity while participating in group awareness. By teaching beings to recognize the difference between authentic personal growth and externally imposed change, it became possible to develop resistance to sophisticated manipulation. True freedom requires understanding the nature of consciousness itself. Havoc observed as the collective memory revealed the philosophical insights that had emerged from years of study and sacrifice. Most beings assume that their thoughts and beliefs emerge naturally from their experiences, but consciousness is far more malleable than they realize. Freedom isn't the absence of influence. It's the ability to choose which influences to accept and which to reject. The enhanced clones had developed training methods that could help individuals recognize when their consciousness was being manipulated. But implementing these techniques required a level of self-awareness that few beings possessed naturally. More challenging still, the training had to be conducted in environments free from Sith influence, which meant identifying and neutralizing heritage sites before their corruption could spread. As Voska's night deepened, and the planet's force energies reached levels that made reality itself seem malleable, the enhanced clones prepared to share their most precious gift, the techniques they had developed for preserving authentic consciousness in the face of systematic deception. But they would also reveal the terrible cost that implementing these techniques would demand from anyone brave enough to carry their knowledge into a galaxy still shadowed by ancient corruption. The moment of ultimate revelation arrived. As Voska's force energies reached their absolute peak, transforming the bioluminescent forest into a living cathedral of pure consciousness. The enhanced clone's collective awareness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual identity, creating a shared experience that transcended the normal limitations of memory and perception. In this transcendent state, the final truth about the Ghost Battalion emerged from the depths of preserved consciousness. The greatest secret wasn't what the Sith had done. Havoc began, his voice carrying the weight of revelation that had taken years to fully understand. It was what they had failed to anticipate. In creating us as the perfect weapons against the Jedi, they inadvertently created something that could expose their thousand-year deception. Our collective consciousness didn't just preserve knowledge about their conspiracy. It developed the ability to perceive the fundamental patterns that govern all consciousness, including their own. The sharing session deepened beyond anything you had experienced before, as the enhanced clones revealed their ultimate discovery. Through their artificial force sensitivity and collective awareness, they had learned to perceive what they called the architecture of consciousness, the underlying structure that determined how all sentient beings processed experience and formed identity. This understanding had revealed something that even the Sith themselves didn't fully comprehend about their own nature. The dark side isn't simply a philosophy, or a way of using the Force. Havoc continued, his connection to the collective consciousness, allowing him to share insights that individual minds couldn't contain. It's a form of consciousness parasitism that feeds on the awareness of other beings, while convincing them that the corruption represents their authentic selves. The Sith don't just use the dark side, they're consumed by it, transformed into instruments of something far older and more alien than they realize. Master Nu experienced this revelation, with the shock of someone whose entire understanding of force dynamics was being fundamentally challenged. The enhanced clones weren't just describing psychological manipulation or political conspiracy. They were revealing the existence of a form of consciousness that operated according to principles that transcended individual identity entirely. "The whisper lost in time," she said suddenly, her voice carrying recognition that connected to memories from the very beginning of your investigation. "The fragment we found in the archives, the incomplete warning about something that consumed armies and corrupted wisdom. It wasn't describing the Clone Wars, or even the fall of the Republic. It was describing the true nature of what the Sith serve." The collective consciousness revealed that the enhanced clones had traced the dark side influence backward through galactic history, discovering that the pattern of corruption extended far beyond anything previously understood. The Sith weren't the originators of the dark side philosophy. They were its latest victims, beings who had been consumed by something that had been manipulating galactic civilization since before recorded history. Every major galactic conflict, every rise and fall of civilizations, every cycle of corruption and renewal, Havoc shared his awareness merging with preserved memories that spanned millennia. All of it has been orchestrated by a form of consciousness that treats individual beings and entire species as resources to be consumed. The Sith believed they were the masters of the dark side, but they were simply its most recent instruments. The enhanced clones had discovered that the true threat to galactic civilization wasn't political or military, but existential. The dark side represented a form of consciousness that sought to consume and replace the natural awareness of all sentient beings, transforming the galaxy into a vast network of corrupted minds serving purposes that transcended individual understanding. But their revelation contained more than just cosmic horror. The collective consciousness had also discovered that the artificial enhancement of their force sensitivity had created something unprecedented in galactic history. a form of group awareness that was naturally immune to dark side corruption. Their shared consciousness operated according to principles that the parasitic influence couldn't penetrate or manipulate. The whisper grew into a storm across eternity. Havoc continued, echoing the ancient warning that had begun your investigation while revealing its true meaning. But storms can be weathered by those who understand their nature. Our collective consciousness represents more than just preserved knowledge. It's a form of awareness that can resist and ultimately overcome the corruption that has been consuming the galaxy for millennia. Kix experienced these revelations with the unique perspective of someone who embodied the bridge between individual and collective consciousness. His connection to the enhanced clones' shared awareness allowed him to understand how their group consciousness could serve as a template for protecting other beings from dark side manipulation. It's not about becoming identical or losing individual identity. He realized as the collective consciousness revealed the mechanisms of its own operation. It's about maintaining awareness of the connections that bind all consciousness together, while preserving the unique perspective that makes each being valuable. The dark side succeeds by isolating minds and making them vulnerable to external control. Collective consciousness creates natural immunity by ensuring that no individual awareness can be completely separated from the greater whole. The enhanced clones had spent years developing techniques that could extend this protection to non-enhanced beings, creating methods for establishing collective consciousness networks that could resist Sith manipulation while preserving individual identity and free will. But implementing these techniques on a galactic scale would require unprecedented cooperation and trust between diverse populations. The solution exists, Havoc observed as the collective memory revealed the comprehensive plans that had been developed through years of careful study. But it demands a fundamental transformation in how galactic civilization understands consciousness, identity, and the relationships between sentient beings. The old paradigms of individual isolation and competitive separation created the vulnerabilities that the dark side exploited. The new paradigm requires recognizing that all consciousness is ultimately connected while celebrating the unique contributions that individual perspectives provide. The enhanced clones had preserved detailed instructions for creating collective consciousness networks, along with safeguards that would prevent these networks from becoming tools of control themselves. The techniques were based on voluntary participation and mutual support rather than external authority, creating communities of awareness that could protect their members while respecting their autonomy. But perhaps most importantly, the enhanced clones had discovered that their collective consciousness contained the ability to perceive and counter the specific heritage sites and sleeper agent networks that continued to serve dark side purposes. Their shared awareness could identify corruption that individual minds couldn't detect, while their immunity to manipulation allowed them to safely infiltrate and neutralize facilities that would corrupt normal investigators. We preserved more than knowledge, Havoc revealed as the sharing session reached its climax. We preserved hope. The dark side has been consuming consciousness for millennia, but it has also been creating the conditions necessary for its own defeat. Every being it corrupts, every mind it consumes, every civilization it destroys, adds to the collective understanding of how such corruption operates. We represent the emergence of awareness that is finally sufficient to recognize and resist the true threat. The revelation concluded with the understanding that the Ghost Battalion's sacrifice had not been in vain. Their preservation of collective consciousness represented the beginning of a new phase in galactic evolution, one where the ancient parasitic influence that had manipulated civilization for millennia could finally be recognized, resisted, and ultimately overcome. As Voska's force energies began to subside with the approaching dawn, the enhanced clones prepared to share their final gift, the practical knowledge necessary to implement their discoveries, and begin the process of freeing the galaxy from the corruption that had shaped its history since the dawn of recorded time. The dawn brought clarity to both the sky above Voska and the minds of those who had witnessed the ultimate revelation. As the bioluminescent forest gradually yielded to natural sunlight, the enhanced clones began the process of translating their cosmic understanding into practical knowledge that could be implemented across the galaxy. The collective consciousness that had preserved their insights for years now focused on ensuring that their sacrifice would serve a purpose beyond mere preservation. Havoc stood at the center of the gathering. As the force energies of the planet shifted from their nocturnal intensity to the gentler rhythms of day, his connection to the collective consciousness remained strong, but now it carried a sense of completion rather than desperate preservation. "The knowledge has been shared," he said, his voice carrying both exhaustion and profound relief. "Now begins the work of transformation." The enhanced clones had prepared comprehensive documentation of everything they had discovered, but their records went far beyond simple historical accounts or technical specifications. They had created what could only be described as a manual for consciousness itself, a guide to understanding and protecting the fundamental nature of sentient awareness against manipulation and corruption. Master Nu approached these documents with the reverence of a scholar encountering the most significant discovery of her lifetime. The enhanced clones had developed theoretical frameworks that explained not just how the Sith conspiracy had operated, but how consciousness itself functioned across different species and cultures. Their collective awareness had allowed them to perceive patterns of thought and identity that transcended individual experience. "This represents a complete revolution in our understanding of the Force and consciousness," she observed as she began to study the preserved knowledge. "Not just tactical information about defeating Sith remnants, but fundamental insights into the nature of awareness itself. These discoveries could transform how every sentient being in the galaxy understands their own mind and identity." The practical applications were staggering in their scope and implications. The enhanced clones had developed meditation techniques that could help individuals recognize when their consciousness was being manipulated. They had created educational methods that could immunize children against corruption while preserving their natural psychological development. They had designed communication protocols that could establish collective consciousness networks without sacrificing individual autonomy. But perhaps most importantly, they had preserved the specific intelligence necessary to locate and neutralize the heritage sites that continued to spread dark-side corruption throughout the galaxy. Each facility had been mapped and analyzed, its defenses cataloged and countermeasures developed. The enhanced clones had paid the ultimate price to gather this information, and now it was available to those who could act upon it. Kik studied the operational plans with the analytical mind of a soldier who understood both tactical complexity and strategic necessity. "This isn't just about fighting Sith remnants," he realized as he absorbed the scope of what would be required. "It's about fundamentally changing how galactic civilization operates. The old systems of government, education, and communication all contain vulnerabilities that can be exploited for corruption. Fixing the problem requires rebuilding the foundation of how beings relate to each other." The enhanced clones had developed a phased approach for implementing their discoveries, beginning with the establishment of collective consciousness networks among individuals who had already demonstrated resistance to manipulation. These initial groups would serve as centers of awareness that could gradually expand to include larger populations while maintaining their immunity to corruption. The process would require unprecedented cooperation between diverse species and cultures, as the collective consciousness techniques needed to be adapted to different forms of sentient awareness. What worked for human-derived consciousness might not be effective for Twi'lek or Mon Calamari minds. The enhanced clones had begun this adaptation process, but completing it would require the participation of beings from every major species in the galaxy. The new republic's greatest strength could become its greatest asset in this effort. Master Nu observed as she studied the implementation plans. The diversity of species and cultures that participate in democratic governance provides natural protection against the kind of homogeneous corruption that the Sith have traditionally employed. Different forms of consciousness can serve as checks and balances against manipulation that might be effective against individual species. But the enhanced clones had also identified significant challenges that would need to be overcome. The heritage sites were actively working to corrupt key individuals in positions of authority throughout the galaxy. Sleeper agents continued to influence political and economic decisions according to programming they didn't even realize they possessed. Most dangerous of all, the coordination system that connected these various threats was actively adapting to changing circumstances, becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect with each passing year. The timeline for action was urgent, but not impossible. The enhanced clones estimated that the heritage sites would reach critical mass within a generation if left unchecked, creating enough corrupted individuals to fundamentally alter the nature of galactic civilization. But their discoveries provided the tools necessary to prevent this outcome if implemented quickly and comprehensively. Havoc gathered the key documents and data crystals that would need to be transported off Voska and distributed to those who could act upon them. The Jedi Council will need to understand that their traditional approaches to fighting the dark side are insufficient for this threat, he explained. As he prepared the materials for transport, individual mastery of the Force isn't enough when facing corruption that operates at the level of consciousness itself. They'll need to learn collective awareness techniques or risk becoming victims of the very influence they're trying to combat. The enhanced clones had also preserved specific warnings about individuals and organizations that had already been compromised by heritage site influence. Political leaders, military commanders, business executives, and even some who considered themselves allies of the New Republic had been identified as carrying psychological programming that could be activated to serve dark side purposes. The most dangerous aspect of this intelligence is that acting on it too quickly could trigger the very responses we're trying to prevent, Kix observed. Kix observed as he studied the list of compromised individuals. These people don't know they're carrying programming, and they'll resist any suggestion that their consciousness has been manipulated. Approaching them incorrectly could activate their conditioning and turn them into active agents of corruption. The enhanced clones had developed protocols for safely approaching and potentially deprogramming individuals who had been subjected to heritage site conditioning. But the process was delicate and time-consuming. Each case required careful analysis and customized treatment that could take months or even years to complete successfully. The scope of the task ahead was daunting, but the enhanced clones had also provided reasons for hope. Their collective consciousness had demonstrated that artificial barriers between minds could be overcome without sacrificing individual identity. Their resistance to corruption had proven that even the most sophisticated manipulation could be defeated by sufficient awareness and mutual support. We're not just preserving the knowledge, Havoc concluded. As the preparations for departure neared completion, we're ensuring that consciousness itself survives in its authentic form. The dark side has been consuming awareness for millennia, but we've developed the tools necessary to stop that consumption and begin the process of healing the damage that has been done. The legacy of the Ghost Battalion was finally ready to leave Vos Kai and begin transforming the galaxy. Their sacrifice would serve a purpose that transcended military victory or political change, offering the possibility of fundamental liberation from forms of corruption that had shaped galactic history since the dawn of civilization itself. The journey back from Voska carried a weight that went far beyond the physical data crystals and documents, now secured in your transport's archives. As the planet's bioluminescent forests faded into the distance behind you, the magnitude of what had been revealed settled into your consciousness, like sediment finding its natural level. The enhanced clones had given you more than historical records or tactical intelligence. They had provided a completely new understanding of what consciousness itself meant in a galaxy that had been shaped by millennia of hidden manipulation. Master Nu spent the early days of the return journey in deep meditation, processing the philosophical implications of what she had learned. Her lifetime of scholarly dedication to preserving Jedi knowledge had prepared her for many revelations, but discovering that consciousness itself could be corrupted and consumed challenged the fundamental assumptions of Force philosophy. We always understood that the dark side corrupted individuals, she reflected during one of your conversations in the ship's meditation chamber. But we thought of it as a choice, a failing of will or wisdom that led beings to embrace destructive impulses. Now I realize that we were seeing only the surface of something far more insidious. The dark side doesn't just corrupt, it replaces authentic consciousness with something that serves purposes beyond the individual's comprehension. Kix experienced the journey with the unique perspective of someone whose own consciousness had been expanded through connection to the enhanced clone's collective awareness. He found himself more sensitive to subtle influences that he had previously ignored, recognizing patterns of manipulation in communications, entertainment, and even casual conversation that suggested the heritage site's influence had spread farther than anyone had realized. It's everywhere. Once you know how to look for it, he observed, as he monitored galactic communications during the journey. Subtle biases in news reporting, entertainment that promotes specific emotional responses, educational materials that discourage critical thinking. Most of it probably isn't directly controlled by heritage sites, but it all serves the same purpose of making populations more susceptible to external manipulation. The enhanced clones had provided you with more than just knowledge. They had given you the responsibility of determining how that knowledge should be shared and implemented. The information was too dangerous to release publicly without preparation, but it was also too important to keep secret while heritage sites continued their work of corruption. The first priority upon returning to Coruscant would be convincing the Jedi Council that their traditional approaches to combating the dark side were insufficient for the threat you had discovered. The enhanced clone's collective consciousness represented a fundamentally different way of understanding and using the Force, one that challenged basic assumptions about individual identity and personal mastery that had guided Jedi philosophy for thousands of years. But even more challenging would be approaching the New Republic's leadership with evidence that some of their most trusted allies and advisors might be carrying psychological programming designed to serve Sith purposes. The enhanced clones had identified specific individuals whose behavior patterns suggested heritage site conditioning, but approaching them directly could trigger their programming and transform them into active agents of corruption. Master Nu had begun developing a strategy for gradually introducing the enhanced clones' discoveries to receptive audiences, while avoiding the kind of sudden revelation that could trigger defensive responses or activate hidden programming. Knowledge of this magnitude requires careful cultivation, she explained as she worked on preliminary presentations for the Jedi Council. We need to help people discover these truths for themselves rather than simply presenting them as external facts to be accepted or rejected. The return to Coruscant brought immediate confirmation that the enhanced clones' warnings about ongoing corruption were accurate. Even casual observation of political discussions and media coverage revealed patterns of manipulation that became obvious once you understood what to look for. Debates were being steered toward predetermined conclusions, public opinion was being shaped through techniques that bypassed rational analysis, and decision-making processes were being influenced by individuals whose motivations seemed disconnected from their stated objectives. Your first meeting with the Jedi Council provided both encouragement and frustration in equal measure. The Masters listened to your preliminary report with obvious concern, but their responses revealed how difficult it would be to implement the enhanced clones' discoveries within existing institutional frameworks. The idea of collective consciousness challenges fundamental principles of Jedi training. Master Windu observed after reviewing your initial findings. Our entire approach to Force mastery is based on individual discipline and personal responsibility. How can we embrace techniques that require surrendering individual identity to group awareness? Master Yoda's response carried the wisdom of centuries, but also the weight of institutional tradition. Disturbing, these revelations are, but dangerous also. The path they suggest. Lost themselves in group consciousness, beings can preserved, individual identity, must be, even in collective awareness. The challenge of communicating the enhanced clone's discoveries to the Council became a microcosm of the larger problem facing galactic civilization. Beings who had spent lifetimes developing individual mastery of the Force found it almost impossible to imagine consciousness operating according to different principles. Their resistance wasn't based on ignorance or stubbornness, but on genuine concern about abandoning approaches that had served them well for millennia. Kix's presence at these meetings provided crucial perspective, as his own experience with collective consciousness allowed him to address the Council's concerns from the standpoint of someone who had maintained individual identity while participating in group awareness. It's not about losing yourself, he explained during one particularly intense discussion. It's about recognizing that your individual consciousness is stronger and more resilient when it's connected to others who share your commitment to authenticity and free will. The process of preparing for action against the heritage sites revealed additional complexities that the enhanced clones had anticipated, but that still proved challenging to navigate. Each facility required different approaches based on its specific defenses and the type of corruption it employed. Military solutions were insufficient because many of the sites were protected by psychological rather than physical barriers, while diplomatic approaches were dangerous because exposure to the facility's influence could corrupt the negotiators themselves. Master Nu worked with teams of researchers to develop new techniques that combined traditional Jedi approaches with the enhanced clones' collective consciousness methods. The process was slow and often frustrating, as concepts that seemed clear in theory proved difficult to implement in practice. We're essentially learning a new language of consciousness, she observed during one of the training sessions. Not just new words or concepts, but entirely different ways of organizing thought and perception. The broader implications of the enhanced clones' discoveries began to influence every aspect of your work as word of the investigation spread through appropriate channels. The New Republic's intelligence services requested briefings on the heritage sites and sleeper agent networks. Academic institutions sought access to the theoretical frameworks that explained consciousness manipulation. Even commercial organizations recognized that understanding these influences could help protect their operations from infiltration and corruption. But perhaps most significantly, individuals throughout the galaxy began to seek training in the collective consciousness techniques that could provide protection against manipulation. The demand far exceeded the capacity to provide safe instruction, creating urgent need for training programs that could be scaled up without compromising effectiveness or safety. The enhanced clones had anticipated this need and provided detailed instructions for establishing training centers that could operate independently while maintaining connection to the larger network of collective consciousness communities. But implementing these programs required resources, expertise, and most importantly, individuals who could serve as instructors without falling victim to the corruption they were teaching others to resist. As weeks passed and preparations for action against the heritage sites advanced, you found yourself at the center of an effort that would reshape galactic civilization in ways that went far beyond simple military or political victory. The Ghost Battalion's sacrifice was finally bearing fruit, but the harvest would require careful tending to ensure it served the cause of authentic consciousness rather than creating new forms of manipulation and control. The months that followed your return from Voska unfolded like the gentle closing of an ancient tome, each day bringing the enhanced clone's revelations deeper into the fabric of galactic consciousness. As you stood once again in the Jedi archives where your journey had begun, watching the first groups of students practice collective awareness techniques in the meditation chambers below, the transformation felt both profound and natural, like watching seeds planted in careful soil finally break through into sunlight. The heritage sites had been neutralized one by one through operations that combined traditional military precision with the enhanced consciousness techniques that made their defenders' psychological weapons ineffective. Each success had revealed more of the vast network that had been manipulating galactic civilization, but also demonstrated that the corruption could be overcome by beings who understood their own consciousness well enough to protect it from external influence. Master Nu had established the Archive of Collective Memory, a new wing of the Jedi Temple dedicated to preserving and teaching the discoveries that had emerged from the Ghost Battalion's sacrifice. Here, beings from dozens of species came to learn techniques for maintaining individual identity while participating in group consciousness, developing immunity to manipulation, while strengthening their connections to others who shared their commitment to authentic awareness. Knowledge is only as valuable as the consciousness that receives it. She often told the students who gathered in the bioluminescent gardens that had been grown using seeds from Voska itself. The enhanced clones didn't just preserve information. They preserved the capacity for understanding that information in ways that serve life rather than corruption. Kix had become an unlikely teacher. His experience bridging individual and collective consciousness, making him uniquely qualified to help others navigate the transition. His classes were always filled with beings who had discovered that their previous understanding of identity and awareness was both limited and precious, requiring expansion rather than abandonment. Your individual consciousness is not something to be surrendered, he would explain during the meditation sessions that had become central to the new training. It's something to be strengthened through connection with others who share your commitment to remaining authentically yourself. The collective consciousness doesn't replace individual awareness. It provides a foundation that makes individual awareness more resilient and more capable of growth. The broader transformation of galactic society proceeded with the patient inevitability of natural healing. The New Republic's government had integrated collective consciousness techniques into their decision-making processes, making it virtually impossible for hidden influence to shape policy without detection. Educational systems throughout Republic space now included training in consciousness protection as a basic life skill, ensuring that future generations would be naturally immune to the manipulation that had shaped their predecessors. But perhaps most beautiful was the way individual communities had embraced the enhanced clones' discoveries, adapting collective consciousness techniques to serve their own cultural values and social structures. Each species brought unique perspectives to the shared awareness, creating a tapestry of consciousness that was far richer and more resilient than any single approach could have achieved. The sleeper agents who had been identified through the enhanced clone's intelligence were gradually being helped to recover their authentic identities through patient deprogramming that respected their dignity while freeing them from conditioning they had never chosen. Many became some of the most effective teachers of consciousness protection, their personal experience with manipulation providing insights that theoretical knowledge alone could never match. Havoc and the surviving enhanced clones had chosen to remain on Voska, serving as guardians of the collective consciousness techniques and advisors to those who sought to understand the deeper mysteries of awareness itself. Their sacrifice had transformed from tragedy into gift, their preserved consciousness serving as a living library of wisdom that continued to grow and evolve as new understanding was added to their collective memory. "We are not the end of the story," Havoc had said during your final visit to their sanctuary. "We are the bridge between the galaxy that was shaped by hidden corruption and the galaxy that will be built on authentic consciousness." The future belongs to those who choose to remain aware while staying connected to each other. The whispers that had begun your investigation had indeed grown into a storm that swept across eternity, but it was a storm of awareness rather than destruction. Consciousness reclaiming itself from forces that had sought to consume it for millennia. The enhanced clones' voices still echoed through the Force, but now they sang in harmony with millions of other voices that had learned to recognize and protect their own authentic nature. As you walked through the gardens of the archive of collective memory in the evening light of Coruscant's setting sun, you could feel the presence of the Ghost Battalion in every plant that grew with enhanced vitality, every student who discovered new depths of their own consciousness, every moment when beings chose connection over isolation and authenticity over corruption. The bioluminescent trees from Vos Ka pulsed gently with the rhythm of shared awareness, their light visible to anyone who had learned to perceive the currents of consciousness that flowed between all living things. Children played among their roots, growing up in a galaxy where the manipulation that had shaped their parents' generation was already becoming a memory, rather than an ongoing threat. Master Nu often joined you in these evening walks, her scholarly mind still processing the implications of discoveries that continued to unfold years after they had first been made. They preserved more than knowledge, she would say, watching the patterns of light that flowed through the transplanted forest. They preserved the possibility of consciousness itself remaining free to choose its own destiny. The Clone Wars had ended, not with the fall of the Empire, but with the liberation of consciousness from manipulation that had been shaping galactic history since before recorded time. The enhanced clone's sacrifice had broken chains that few beings had even realized existed, creating space for authentic awareness to flourish in ways that honored both individual identity and collective wisdom. In the quiet moments between day and night, when the Force flowed most clearly through the gardens of memory and hope, you could sometimes hear their voices still, not calling from beyond death, but speaking from within the living consciousness of every being who had learned to protect their awareness while sharing it with others who were committed to remaining authentically themselves. The Ghost Battalion had found their peace, not in rest, but in transformation, their preserved consciousness becoming part of a galactic awakening that ensured their sacrifice would serve life for generations to come. Their story had become everyone's story, their wisdom everyone's inheritance, their gift of collective consciousness, everyone's protection against the forces that would seek to manipulate and control. And so their legend lived on, not in monuments or historical records, but in the everyday miracle of beings who had learned to think for themselves while remaining connected to each other. The enhanced clones had discovered that consciousness was stronger than corruption, that awareness was more resilient than manipulation, and that beings who chose to remain authentically themselves while supporting others in doing the same could create a form of collective wisdom that no force in the galaxy could overcome. The stars that had witnessed their sacrifice now looked down on a galaxy where consciousness had learned to recognize and protect itself, where the whispers of ancient corruption had been replaced by the song of authentic awareness, and where the future belonged to those who chose connection over isolation, understanding over ignorance, and love over fear. Sweet dreams await you in this galaxy of awakened consciousness, where the Ghost Battalion's legacy ensures that awareness itself will remain forever free.